remarkable these creatures really are. And you begin to get a sense that God is actually governing His world, the world that He made, right? You begin to see how well put together the entire universe is. You begin to see how the creatures that God makes are able to hunt and to get their food, and how intricately designed it all really is. Now, theologically, we call this the doctrine or the teaching, the idea of providence. Providence. Providence is the idea that God not only creates the world, but it's also the idea that God governs and rules over the world, that He cares for that which He creates. The Heidelberg Catechism is one of the three confessions in the Reformed tradition, the three documents or the three teachings that summarize how we understand the Bible. And when the Heidelberg Catechism talks about providence, it says that providence is the almighty, ever-present power of God, by which He upholds heaven and earth and so rules them that all things come to us not by chance, but from His fatherly hand. In other words, providence is the idea that God rules over all things, that He is sovereign over everything, that He has power over all that He has made, that the universe is not a random place. It's not a place without order and structure, but actually it's a place over which God Himself is in control. Now, if you read through Job chapter 38 and you go into Job 39 and 40 and 41, that's essentially what God is saying to Job. When God finally speaks to Job, what does He focus on? When God answers Job about the problem of suffering, what does God say to Job? He comes and He really gives him a tour of the universe. He gives them a glimpse over the entire cosmos, from the greatest stars in the sky down to the creatures that God has made. And He makes at least three points, just very briefly, three ideas. The first is that God creates. If you look in verses 3 through 7 or 4 through 7, what does God say? He says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" In other words, where were you when I created the world? And He reminds Job that He laid the foundations and He drove in the pilings of the foundation, and He goes on to talk about how He brought the water upon the earth and everything else. In other words, God says to Job, I created everything. I created all things. God is the creator. If you look a little further, verses 31 through 36 on the next page over, God talks to Job about the stars in the night sky, the constellations. And He talks about how He is governing and ruling over the stars. He goes on to talk about the clouds and the lightning bolts and the weather and the rain and the hail and the storehouses in the sky. The idea is that God is ruler. He's sovereign. He's in control over the weather, the wind, the rain, the seasons. And then verses 39 through, well, it goes through 41, but actually it continues on to chapter 39. God talks about His care for the animals, how He feeds the ravens and He feeds the lions. And as I said in chapter 39, God goes through more of the animals that God has made, that He has made, and how He cares for them, that He's the one to provide food for them. Now, of course, we know God works through intermediary ways to do that. God doesn't just drop the food out of the sky, but He orchestrates and arranges His world so that all of His creatures are fed and cared for. And that's the idea of God, God sustaining or providing for what He has made. So God creates, governs, and provides for all creation. And the imagery in this whole text is really so powerful. You get a picture of God as an architect, an engineer, a builder, a decorator, a midwife, a meteorologist, a veterinarian. All of that imagery is woven through to say that God is holding together and governing and ruling over everything that He has made. Now, if you read a little bit closely, some of you might be wondering to yourself, well, wait a minute. How can God be saying this? I mean, how are we supposed to take this literally, especially at the beginning where it talks about God measuring out the foundations of the world and then driving in the cornerstone and the pilings for the foundation. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how can that be accurate? Isn't this just sort of what the people in ancient times, they didn't understand, they didn't have scientific knowledge, and so they just sort of projected an idea of God onto something they didn't understand? Well, that's a fair question. But here's what you need to understand. First of all, put one more picture up here. If you were in my Sunday school class, you saw this. You need to understand how the ancient world understood the universe. They had, of course, a very different picture of what the world looked like. They didn't have the scientific knowledge that we do, and so they pictured the earth as flat, and at each of the four corners they pictured foundation, like pilings driven into the ground, and then a dome over top, and that dome was the sky, and water above the sky, that you open the windows of the sky and the water would come down, and God was above. That's how the ancients looked at the universe. Now what you see God doing in Job chapter 38, 39, 40, and 41, God is speaking and He's communicating in a way that would have been understood by Job. He's using the language that Job would have understood. He's using the imagery that Job and other people in that time would have recognized. In other words, God accommodates Himself to speak to people in ways that they understand. Now today, if God were to make a similar speech, He might well have used a more scientific description. He might well have pointed to science and used that as a way to impress upon Him His greatness. That's why I began as I did, because to help you see the way that God reveals Himself also through science and through the size of the universe and through what we understand about the universe. That's, by the way, why I think science plays such an important part in our world. Sometimes we see faith and science as opposed ideas. But really, science can be a way that we understand and know God better. In fact, Francis Collins, he was the leader of the Human Genome Project. Human Genome Project was that attempt to map out the human DNA. And when he began that project, he was a non-believer. He was an atheist. And he began to study the intricacy of the human genome and human DNA. And he began to be more and more convinced that this could not be here by accident. The world could not be here simply by random chance. He became more and more convinced that there was a creator behind everything that he saw, especially in the DNA. This is what he wrote. He said, "The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. God can be found in the cathedral or in the laboratory. By investigating God's awesome and majestic creation, science can be a means of worship." Why do I say that? Because ultimately that's what God is doing here in Job 38. He's revealing Himself in creation. He's revealing His power and His sovereignty and His wisdom over all creation, not to give Job a simple lesson, a Sunday school lesson, but to lead Job to worship. God is revealing His greatness so that Job will respond by bowing down before God and adoring Him. Now that's key, because all through this whole book of Job, what's the book been about? It's been about Job suffering. And you know, all along, what has Job wanted more than anything else? He's wanted answers. He's asked God, why is this happening? And I don't think that's so different for many of us today. If you have or are going through a time where your world falls apart, where your hopes and dreams come crashing down, or when you experience deep pain, you want to know why. You want to know, why is God letting this happen to me? And the thing about it is that God doesn't very often answer that question for us. And I think we can really only speculate here, but I think it makes sense. I imagine how the story would have gone very differently had God answered Job that way. I imagine if God had showed up to Job and said, "Job, listen, you've been through a lot. I know you've suffered. And I just want you to know, Job, that it's not going to last much longer. But more than that, Job, I want you to know that in thousands of years from now, People are still going to be talking about you. People are going to be looking to your story to give them encouragement in the midst of their comfort, in the midst of their suffering. Job, people are going to use you as the example of how to face suffering. Imagine if God had said something like that to Job. On the one hand, you think that wouldn't be so bad, would it? But imagine what would happen in Job's heart and mind after that. Sure, he'd still face suffering, but he'd say, okay, I just need to get through this a little bit longer. I just have to hang in there a little more, and then I'm going to be this example. I'm going to be this person that everyone looks to. Right now I understand. Now it all makes sense, so this isn't so bad. You see how that would change everything? Job would no longer be forced to trust in God when it doesn't make sense. He'd simply be trusting in God because now he understands and now he knows. And that would, in a way, that would lessen his dependence and his trust in God. Now he's got the explanation. But you see, worshiping God sometimes requires that we trust in God even when, and especially when, we don't understand what God is doing. And so when God finally answers Job, what does he say? Well, first of all, we read in verses 1 through 3 that God shows up in a storm. Some texts have it's a whirlwind. And you shouldn't have it in your mind that it's like a little rainstorm or a little dust devil that spins across the land that you sometimes see in the summer. When God shows up in a storm, or when God shows up at any time, it's something absolutely terrifying. Think of the Israelites at Mount Sinai. They come before the mountain and they beg and plead Moses, don't make us get any closer, because if we do, it's going to destroy us. They were in the presence of God and it terrified them. When Elijah was standing up on that same mountain many hundreds of years later, Elijah looks out of the mouth of that cave and he sees an earthquake and he sees lightning and he sees, a hurricane, and none of that really scares him because God wasn't in those things. But when Elijah hears the still small voice, when Elijah hears God's presence, all of a sudden he's afraid and he covers his face. You see, when God's presence shows up, it's a terrifying thing. And God shows up to Job. And it must have been a frightening thing for Job. And then God begins to speak. And as I said, he doesn't just tell Job the answers. He takes God on a tour of the universe. And the point in all of that God is saying is to help Job see how big God really is. He's the God who puts stars in their place. He's the God who cuts a channel through the earth so that the rivers can flow. He's a God that causes the grass to sprout. He's a God that causes lions to hunt their prey, who causes animals to give birth. He's a God that causes it to rain and to hail and to lightning. He's a God who is sovereign over all things. And Job begins to see how big God really is. Now, this is key. God doesn't do this to trivialize Job or to trivialize his suffering. God doesn't say, come on, Job, I've got bigger things to worry about. Job, I'm so much bigger than you. You're just a puny little guy down there. What do I care about your suffering? That's not what God is saying to Job. God shows all of this to him, not to make Job look small, but to make God look enormous. See, when you go through a time of hardship, whether it's illness, whether it's a loss of a relationship, whether it's uncertainty about your future, loss of a job, broken family, God doesn't look down at you and say, your suffering, your problems are nothing to me. He says, I am far bigger than these. I want you to look at your suffering next to me. See your problem, see your difficulty, your affliction in the scope of God and His greatness and His power. God wants to teach us to see that our suffering isn't small, but that our God is enormous. And that begins to now bring the whole message of Job together. That gives us an explanation, or at least it gives us a response to suffering. See, all along, the three friends, they've really reduced the universe down. When they reduce God down, it's like they reduce the whole universe down. It's like bad people get bad things, good people get good things, and if you're bad, then you can expect bad, and if you think you're good but you're getting bad things, then you're probably bad, and so you got to fix your behavior. Right? That's such a small universe. That becomes a universe that's just like a formula. It's such a small, shrunken world. That's when the three friends look at the world, that's how they make sense of suffering. I think it's important to note that suffering is one of the big questions that many people have, or maybe even an objection, one of the big objections that the world has to Christianity. How can God allow suffering? If there really is a God, how is he allowing so much pain in this world? That's a genuine, a legitimate question to ask. But it's not a question that only Christianity has to answer. Every worldview has to answer that. Everyone has to somehow come to grips with that. And if you look at the world today, nihilism is a philosophy that's widespread today. Nihilism just says there's no point to anything. Life is meaningless. You're just here by chance. You live and die. There's no purpose. There's no bigger purpose to it. And then you die. That's it. You're gone. And in that worldview, suffering is meaningless. Suffering is random. Suffering happens by chance. And there's ultimately no real redemptive value because in the end we just go back into the earth where we came from and that's it. Hinduism. Hinduism says, you know what? You're suffering because in a previous life you did something pretty terrible. And karma says you have to pay for it. If you go to a country like India, you see that there's, well, first of all, it's a Hindu worldview that predominates. And there's very little incentive to do anything about the immense suffering in that country because then you're short-circuiting that process of healing yourself. So they allow all kinds of suffering because suffering is cleansing the soul. Buddhism says, what suffering? Suffering's an illusion. You're too attached to something. Just let go and then you won't be suffering anymore. And I could go on. Every worldview, every religion, every philosophy has to somehow make sense of suffering, but Christianity stands apart. Christianity not only says that God is sovereign over all, that God is bigger than the entire universe, Christianity says that God actually entered the world to do something about it. God asks Job that question at the beginning, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? And of course, Job, to that, what can Job say? Nowhere. Job can only say, I wasn't around. But you know what? Hebrews 1 tells us that Jesus was there when the foundations of the world were laid and when the morning stars sang together. Jesus was there. Christianity says that there is someone who was there, witnessing creation come into being. And God goes on and he asks Job that question, Job, do you have the wisdom to run the universe? And of course, Job to that can only answer, I guess not. Colossians 1 reminds us and tells us that Jesus was not only there at creation, but he is the one through whom creation was made, the one by whom all creation holds together. Christianity says that in Jesus, the entire universe finds its meaning and its purpose. The entire universe holds together in Jesus. And not only that, but when the world fell off of its axis spiritually, when the world fell into sin, God didn't look down at this world and say, well, now they're going to suffer and that's the end of it and they really did it to themselves, so I'm done with it. God comes down into the world. Jesus becomes a part of the suffering. Christianity says that the gods aren't distant and removed, but God is present in the world. He enters into the suffering. He becomes a part of it. He bears the suffering of this world, the sin of this world, on himself. And once again, in Jesus, on Calvary, God appears. And God speaks out of the storm. And God reveals The storm of His presence on the cross, where you see the holiness and the righteousness and the perfect justice of God demonstrated and on full display, and it would have been a terrifying sight to see. But it's there on the cross where God reveals Himself again, that God deals once and for all with the problem of suffering and evil. God deals with it at its root. He destroys the root by carrying it on Himself and by removing it away. So Christianity, the message of the gospel is that the ultimate answer to the problem of suffering, even if we don't get all the answers to the particulars, we get the ultimate answer in that God has dealt with suffering at its root in Jesus Christ at the cross. And what does that mean for us? That means we can go back to the words of the Heidelberg Catechism again that talk about providence. Because the Heidelberg Catechism asks that question, well, what good does all of this do for us? And the answer is that because of this, because we know and trust God's providence, we can be patient when things go against us, thankful when things go well, and for the future we can have good confidence and hope in our faithful Father that nothing will separate us from His love. Let's pray. Lord, we thank You for Your sovereignty, Your power, Your authority over all creation. Lord, help us to see and to marvel at the greatness of the universe in which we live. Help us to marvel at the way that You care for